Welcome back to episode 4, part 2 of Blood, Gold, and Ink, the administrative theft of the Indian Woods and the colored reclassification of the Tuscarora.
Welcome to my podcast. It's a window to the past of history, ancestry, and genealogy, not a story.
Welcome back to episode 4, part 3 of Blood, Gold, and Ink, the administrative theft of the Indian Woods and the colored classification of the Tuscarora. Now, we are going to focus on how the clan mothers specifically organized the resistance against the 1924 Racial Integrity Act to protect these lineages. Now, the lineages are connected biblically to the tribes. The clan mothers were the secret architects of survival during the 1924 Racial Integrity Act. While men like Walter Plecker used the law to paper over indigenous identity, the women used the matrilineal system, the law of the mother, to preserve the bloodline in the shadows. First, the clan mothers' resistance of 1924 through 1960s, when the state began a campaign of statistical genocide, retroactively changing birth certificates from Indian to colored. The clan mothers organized a silent but powerful counter-offensive. They used oral registries. Since paper was being used as a weapon, clan mothers maintained oral family Bibles. They gathered the youth and recited the matrilineal lines, ensuring every child knew their bear, wolf, or turtle clan, regardless of what the invader's birth certificate said. Then we have the midwife network. Many Tuscarora women served as community midwives. They intentionally bypassed state-sanctioned hospitals where Plecker's agents monitored births. By delivering babies at home in the swamps of Robeson and Sampson counties, they could delay or circumvent the official relabeling of newborns. Then we have the marriage gatekeeping. Clan mothers dictated who could marry whom. They ensured that dark-skinned Tuscarora lineages intermarried within the clan structure to keep the land and the blood sovereign, even if the state viewed them as a generic mixed population. Biblically, connections to the lost tribe narrative. Now, many Tuscarora researchers and elders connect their history to biblical prophecy, specifically viewing their displacement as a parallel to the Exodus or the scattering of the remnant. Now, these remnants went into swamps, and again, they're referred to as remnants as they did in biblical times. Now, this aligns with biblical themes of a small group that survives a great catastrophe like the Tuscarora War and the 1803 leases to eventually reclaim their holy land, the ancestral territory. Then referring to them as the copper-colored peoples. Biblically, researchers within the tribe often cite Job 30 and 30, quote, "My skin is black upon me," unquote, or Lamentations 5 and 10 to describe the original dark-skinned indigenous appearance, arguing that the biblical Hebrews were a people of color, just like the original Tuscarora. Then we have the modern fulfillment to tie it all in. Now today, the movement to reclaim the Tuscarora name is seen by many as a spiritual awakening. By tearing up the paper genocide labels and returning to the clan system, they believe they are fulfilling the prophecy of the dry bones, which is Ezekiel 37, where a nation that was considered dead and scattered comes back together, bone to bone, and stands up as a great army. The clan mother's role was to keep the dry bones preserved so that today's generation could recognize who they truly are. Now let's look at the linguistic evidence comparing Tuscarora words to ancient dialects to see if there is a smoking gun for this indigenous Hebrew connection. We'll begin with the root for man and people. Now, in some Algonquin and Iroquois dialects, the word for original people or man is Anishinaabe or Ish in Hebrew. Ish specifically means man. Then there are divine names. Researchers note that the Tuscarora word for the creator often utilizes phonetic structures similar to Yahuwah, which is YHUH, which is one of the ancient transliterations of the Hebrew name for the divine. Then we have the hemp connection. The name Scarora, meaning hemp people, refers to milkweed used for cordage and weaving. Biblically, hemp and flax are often associated with the linen used in priestly garments, noted in Exodus 28, which some view as a symbolic link to a priestly or sacred ancestry. Let's get into structural smoking guns. And by that I mean beyond individual words, the matrilineal system shared by the Tuscarora and Jews is considered by many as the strongest evidence. Identity via the mother, both the Tuscarora and Rabbinic Judaism operate on the principle that the entry line into the nation is exclusively through the mother. Now, in both cultures, a person is only fully recognized as a member of the tribe if their mother is a. Now, there's verb-based morphology. Now, like Hebrew, Tuscarora is a highly polysynthetic language where complex meaning is built through prefixes and suffixes added to a central root verb. This weaving together of language is merely twisting, intertwining, a concept found in the Hebrew root kwawa, meaning to wait or to intertwine. Then we discuss the dry bones linguistic persistence, which is that the dark-skinned survivors who faced reclassification, maintaining these specific phonetic sounds was a way to keep the dry bones of their history alive. Then we have the cleanliness practices that the Tuscarora families maintain and how they mirrored the Levitical laws. Now we can examine the specific mourning rituals and laws of cleanliness that Tuscarora families maintained and how they mirrored the Levitical laws. Now, to peel back the layers of conspiracy, which is always a problem, and to look at the recorded ethnological data, we must examine the work of 19th century observers like James Adair and John Larson, who documented the Tuscarora and neighboring tribes before the 1924 reclassifications. They recorded behaviors that were strikingly similar to the Levitical Code, which is the Torah and or the Old Testament. First, we have the laws of cleanliness and separation. Recorded history shows that the Tuscarora maintained strict protocols regarding purity, which the government later used to claim they were segregationists or unassimilable. Then we have the moon time, which means neither, where women were required to separate themselves in a seclusion hut during their menstrual cycles. They were not permitted to touch food prepared for others or handle communal tools. This mirrors Leviticus 15:19 through 24, which mandates a 7-day separation. And in Chicago, being raised by my maternal grandmother, who was from the Mississippi Delta, we were taught. And also, let me throw in my great-grandmother, which was my mom's father's mother, taught us that during the times of a cycle, and I learned this before having a menstrual cycle, that you were not supposed to sit on your bed, sleep on the bed, sit on someone else's bed, or cook or be around others during that time. So this was what was taught to me. And I heard the elders talking about it in the early 70s, the late 70s. I believe soon after going into the 1900s, I mean, not 1900s, but 1990s, a lot of that, those practices were faint to the ear. They weren't being discussed or appeared to be no longer abided by. Okay, so we also have the ablutions, which is the mikvah. Now, John Larson recorded that the Tuscarora were continually washing themselves in running water, which would be your rivers or your creeks, especially after illness or contact with death. This ritual, immersion for spiritual cleanliness, is a cornerstone of Levitical law. And there was practices also about the deaths, the time frame for burial. What do you do during those 7 days of after death and before burial? It was a lot of practices that we were abiding by when it came to death. Then there is dietary restrictions. Early observers noted that many Tuscarora would not eat unclean animals, specifically swine, pigs, or shellfish, long before Christian missionaries arrived. This choice was often described as a superstition by settlers, but it aligns with the laws of kashrut, which is kosher. And there was a lot of use of the term superstitious from the Mississippi Delta migrants to Chicago. These words were utilized. It wasn't, they were not taboo. The things that were done were taboo, but the use of the word superstitious or superstition was not. Then we have the mourning rituals and death and knowing about cleanliness. and how we had to undergo specific purification rites before returning to the village, just as prescribed in Numbers 19:11 through 12. Then we have the Feast of the First Fruits. The Tuscarora held a green corn ceremony, which was not just a harvest party, but a civil and religious renewal. It was for atonement. During this time, all crimes except murder were forgiven. All debts were canceled, and all fires were extinguished and relit from a central holy fire. With that Mississippi Delta grandmother and great-grandmother, we call these soul food days, where grandma or great-grandmother would call us up to the house, and we're sitting around the table eating the meals that were prepared and praying before. And my grandmother cooked sakatosh, which was the green corn or the corn. And this is where we gave forgiveness, asked for forgiveness, and gave forgiveness. And with my grandmother, she would say, I don't care who you're not getting along with, but everyone has or had better be at this dinner. All right. So the atonement of being forgiven and granting forgiveness is a direct parallel to the year of Jubilee and Yom Kippur, which is in Leviticus 25:10. Let's do some exploring into the doctrine of discovery, which is nothing more than legalized land theft. This doctrine is the primary root of the lie. It originated from 15th century papal bulls like Inter Caetera, which granted Christian explorers the right to claim any land not inhabited by Christians. What does this do? It is the legal erasure. It established the concept of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, meaning indigenous people were seen as having no legal title, only a right of occupancy that could be revoked at any time. Then we have the Supreme Court integration. In the landmark 1823 case, Johnson versus McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall formally wrote this doctrine into U.S. law, ruling that discovery gave European nations absolute title to the land, rendering indigenous tribes incapable of owning it themselves. Then we have the $5 Indians, which is nothing more than diluting the bloodline on paper. Now let me explain. While the doctrine of discovery took the land, the Dawes Commission, which is around 1893 through 1907, was used to take the identity. The term $5 Indians refers to white settlers who paid $5 bribes to corrupt government agents to be listed on the Dawes rolls. Now, what did they gain from it? They gained the allotment. By fraudulent enrollment, these indigenous people received land allotments intended for tribal members. Then they have the inversion of identity. While white opportunistic men were buying Indian status for land, the original dark-skinned Tuscarora and other southern indigenous groups were being forcibly reclassified as colored or mulatto in the records like the 1924 Racial Integrity Act. Then it messes up the legacy for real descendants, the Aboriginal. Today, the descendants of these $5 Indians often hold tribal membership based on those fraudulent roles, while original families must fight paper genocide to prove their lineage. Then we have Indian labels to colored. Well, actually, we have individuals starting off as Indian, then labeled to color to ensure that groups like the Tuscarora could never use their historical treaties to challenge the doctrine of discovery. Now let's examine the specific court cases beyond Johnson versus McIntosh, where the state explicitly used these fraudulent $5 enrollments to deny land back to the original people. Now there's court cases like Johnson versus McIntosh, which was a cornerstone case for administrative identity theft. The Supreme Court validated the Curtis Act, which allowed the federal government to bypass tribal governments and determine who was a citizen. The denial of original lineage was the end result. The court ruled that the Dawes Commission had supreme authority to reject applicants if their names didn't appear on previous, often incomplete, state-sanctioned rolls. This was a legal impact. This allowed the government to legally ignore families who had fled to the swamps or were missing from rolls due to earlier paper genocide, while moving forward with allotting land to those the commission chose to recognize. Then we have the case of Cherokee Nation versus Hitchcock of 1902. This case took the occupancy concept and applied it to resources, stripping the original families of any remaining leverage. Now, the congressional supremacy in the courts ruled that the U.S. Congress had plenary power to manage tribal property without tribal consent. It was a lease trap. By affirming the Secretary of the Interior's right to lease tribal lands for oil and minerals, the state effectively ensured that even if a family could prove their identity later, the economic value of their ancestral land had already been legally siphoned away into federal coffers. Then we have the third case, which is United States versus Minnie Atkins, and this was around 1922. This case is a primary example of the state protecting the finality of the rolls even when fraud was suspected. What they did was protect the fraud. The U.S. government contested the enrollment of a specific individual, alleging he was enrolled by mistake or fraud. Then you have the death of treaty rights. Now, for the Tuscarora families in North Carolina, this meant that the 18th century treaties that relied on to claim their Indian woods land were legally repealable by Congress at will. The wardship model reinforced the status of indigenous people as wards rather than sovereign owners, a status used to justify the state's continued papering over of their identity. Now, these cases collectively formed a legal wall that protected the land holdings of $5 Indians and state interests by declaring that the government's official paperwork, no matter how fraudulent or exclusionary, was the absolute legal truth. Foreign land claims. Families used these federal forms to self-identify as Tuscarora rather than the state-assigned labels. The special inquiry, which is columns 30 through 32, which would be columns 31, actually columns 30, 31, and 32. Now, unlike the general census, this schedule required enumerators to record the Indian name, the tribe of the person, and the tribe of both parents. This created a direct ancestral link to the original dark-skinned warriors who fought the invaders, proving that their tribal identity was unbroken despite the paper genocide at the local level. Now let's explore identifying the dark-skinned original ancestors. The 1900 special schedule acted as a living record for families who had retreated into the swamps to avoid removal. Now, in those censuses, they were recorded with fractions of white blood or a percentage of indigenous blood or at 100% indigenous blood. Now, if they had a fraction of white blood, then they would mark that column 0, which meant a person had no white ancestry, if that makes sense. This provided recorded evidence of the original dark-skinned indigenous population that the state was trying to erase. Now, the legacy of the 1900 census in modern research. Today, the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina uses these specific 1900 and 1910 federal records as the primary evidence to fight for state and federal recognition. They prove that their ancestors remained in tribal relations as Indians not taxed, long after the government claimed they had vanished or migrated north. Now let's look into specific family numbers or dwelling locations in the 1900 Robeson County records to see exactly which lineages were recorded as not taxed. We know that the Tuscarora Nation's closest energy center is not a singular point on a Western map, but a network of sacred swamps and ancestral mounds that serve as the nation's spiritual battery. Let's identify with the dark-skinned original ancestors and how we identify them. Now, the 1900 special schedule acted as a living record for families who had retreated into the swamps to avoid removal. And so how they were documented on the census of the degree of blood and the degree of white blood made all the difference. Now, if you had a fraction of white blood, 0 in that column meant a person had no white ancestry, but a fraction of white blood, different numbers were placed there. Now, this provided recorded evidence of the original dark-skinned indigenous population that the state was trying to erase. Then we have the legacy of the 1900 census in modern research. Today, the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina uses these specific 1900 and 1910 federal records is the primary evidence to fight for state and federal recognition. They prove that their ancestors remained in tribal relations as Indians not taxed, long after the government claimed they had vanished or migrated north. If you are reviewing censuses, pay specific attention to specific family numbers or dwelling locations in the 1900 Robeson County records